Hi, Bill. So far, it's just you and me. Hmm. So for you guys who are coming in, let me know that you're here. I'm starting a little bit early tonight just to give more people an opportunity to join us. So just let me know who's here. And I know it's a few minutes early, so we can just say hello while we're waiting for others to join us. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Hello, Miss Snyder. Hello, Bernadette. I'm well. Hi. It's good to see you. Hi, Bill. Bill is on Zoom. Oh, where's our usual Zoom group tonight? There's no one here. Oh, no. Is there something like super important going on tonight that I don't know about somewhere? So I'm just going to wait a few minutes for people to join in. I thought everyone would want to come tonight to learn about the story of Mrs. Q, since we had such a good time talking about Mr. Q last week, but this week we'll talk about Mrs. Q. Hello, Miss Campo. Hi. I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice sounds a little muffled, I think, from my congestion. Hi, Keenan. It's nice to see you. This is so great seeing people on Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. I really like it. Oh, from Indiana. Hi. As you can see tonight, we're back in the cellar kitchen because it's summer and it's warm and it's a bit cooler down here. So we're back in the cellar kitchen for the summer. Some of you might remember this set from last summer when I used it as well. So this is a nice set. I think people really enjoyed it. Looks really nice. And it is an actual kitchen from a building here in New York City. You might know this. This is from the conference house out on Staten Island, or the Billup House as it's called. And this is the cellar kitchen from the Billup House. Yes, I am in my kitchen in the basement. Yes, so a nice little summer setting for us, I hope. I can't believe no one is here on Zoom. Wow. We usually have a big audience on Zoom. I wonder where everyone is. I know the link is working. And I see there are some of you here. I wonder, I am completely disconnected from modern culture. Is there something important going on tonight somewhere that I don't know about that everyone is, watching instead of joining Mrs. Q? Oh, here comes Miss McFarland. Okay, I'll let her in. So I'm just wondering what the big thing that everyone is doing tonight instead of joining live with Mrs. Q. The best thing you can do on a Friday night. Take a trip back to the 18th century and imagine you're there during the founding of our nation when a number of, phenomenal people were doing some really incredible things. Oh, my friend from Setauket is here. Thank you, sir. I must say that as an Italian lady, this is what my natural hair does look like when it is humid and in the summer, although I am wearing a wig. But this is what my hair, some of my personal friends who grew up with me know this is what my hair looks like when it rains. So this is very close to my real hair and texture. And some of you may remember me from the 80s when my hairdo looked a whole lot like this. My big hair 80s days. Oh, great. So more people have joined us here. Oh, Mr. White from Easton. Okay. Now I see all of our usual friends are joining up tonight. So this is really wonderful. While we're getting ready, let me see, let me fix these little curls a little bit. I kind of like how I look in curly hair because it's natural for me. So while we're getting ready to get into our talk, I'm going to have a quick drink of water. A couple of announcements. Next Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be speaking virtually from the Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Library from the Grand Lodge of Freemasons here in New York. And I will post the link to that, or if you just look online for the Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Library, you'll find it. They also have a YouTube channel. Yes, you should rather watch Mrs. Q. I agree. I will post the link to that if you'd like to watch. I'll be speaking there at the Grand Lodge about Aaron Burr and about Aaron Burr's, a bit about his political life, but more about his personal life and his very unusual views about women and the way he raised his daughter, and a bit about his wife. And since it is the Grand Lodge of Freemasons, I will also be talking about various people in his life who were Freemasons and who were Burrites and followers of his. And so I'll be talking a little bit about them as well, as I am learning more myself about who at that time was a Mason and who was not. So this is sort of a new subject for me. So there'll be a little bit of that in there, but not a whole lot because I'm not that good at it yet myself. Hello, Mr. Reed. So next Thursday at 7 p.m. and that will stay on their YouTube channel. So if you don't watch it live, you'll be able to see it later. And I'm hoping that's going to be a really great talk about Aaron Burr. And I will be my 21st century me for that talk. But if you would like to see Mrs. Q again, this Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, so that will be 7 p.m. my time, I will be joining my friend, Mrs. Jo Ray Perkins of Oregon, on her show, Perkins Perspectives, where I will be joining Mrs. Perkins and I will be telling her about the divisive techniques used in the 1760s and 1770s to keep the people of the colonies divided against each other so they would not gang up on the crooked, corrupt politicians of Parliament. So we're going to be talking about that on Sunday, and I will be joining her as Mrs. Q. So if you're a Mrs. Q fan, I will post the link to that. And I think she streams that on Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. But I should know more about that tonight or tomorrow, and I'll be sharing that information. So I hope some of you will join me for those. A little bit more Mrs. Q and an opportunity to see me speak as my regular 21st century self, as if you've never done that. It's kind of the same, except without the hair. I just look a little different. So last week we talked about Mr. Q's life. Oh, and I always forget the business part, which is pretty funny because I'm supposed to be a merchant, right? So the business part, of course, is that if you are enjoying my Mrs. Q Live every week, please consider supporting the Mrs. Q Live project to teach American history, non-revisionist American history, but just from all original source documents as it happened, the good and the bad, and you decide for yourself who you like or don't like and what you think really happened. So those are the links where you can do that on PayPal, Venmo, and Patreon. And thank you very much for those of you who already do support the project. I very much appreciate it. So tonight, I'm going to talk about Mrs. Q's life. Last week, we talked about Mr. Q and him growing up in our life together a little bit. And I apologize in advance because, of course, some of our stories are going to intersect as we did grow up together and we have known each other since we were children. So this might be a little repetitive for you if you were with us last week. And I have some notes here, not because I don't know my life story, but because as I get older, I become scatterbrained and I leave things out that I want to say. And then I remember later in the narration that I forgot them. I try to add them and it all comes out of sequence. So I just have some notes here to make sure I get everything then that I want you to know. And I'm going to start with this picture that I really, really enjoy of Dutch girls in the Hudson Valley. And I really adore this picture. I have a great fondness for it. And the memories it inspires in me of my days growing up in the Hudson Valley and being tutored with my sister and our girlfriends by the very eccentric Mr. Ichabod Crane, who you might know later in life lost his mind and thought he saw a headless Hessian horsemen chasing him. But when we were girls, our father had us tutored. And for some time, that tutor was Mr. Crane. And you can see this is a picture of girls in a graveyard. And that is because Mr. Crane did used to take us to the graveyard and have us practice our reading by reading the inscriptions on the stones. And also it was a way of learning our town's lineage of who was who and whose family was here when. So it was also a way of studying the lineage of our town and our local families. So it was sort of a cultural lesson and a reading lesson. And I truly adore this picture. I'm very, very fond of it. So I wanted to share it with you for a while tonight. I'm going to go back to my regular picture. So like many families in the Hudson Valley area, We were not English, Scottish, or Irish, but from the European continent, as many people were. People were from Holland, they were Dutch, there were Huguenots from France, and other people from Europe escaping the growing reach of the Holy Roman Empire. Oh, here's someone talking about Mr. Crane. Oh, yes, Mr. Ichabod Crane. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a while. So many families of the Hudson Valley were trying to escape the growing reaches of the Holy Roman Empire or Catholicism. So many families who were not Catholic lived in the Hudson Valley. We had no particular felicity for the crown and didn't really view England as our mother country, as many of us did not speak English as a first language, nor did we have English traditions in our family. But we all did enjoy and appreciate our freedom under English rule. And we very much appreciated things like Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, which established the modern monarchy, the British Constitution, and the common law. And here in New York, we all lived under the protections of those things, and we all very much appreciated that and understood that it was from England that we derived those rights and freedoms. But we did not share the same type of connection to England as some of the people in New York City did, who were English, Scottish, or Irish. And you might know that the Scottish and Irish had a particularly unpleasant connection with England during that time. So our love was not as strong, neither was our hatred. So we're more neutral, I think, emotionally in our view toward England, as it was not our homeland. My father, Mr. C, was a successful merchant from the country that you call Italy, which does not exist in my time, right? Italy is still a sequence of city-states allied with the Holy Roman Empire. And he was from the part of Italy known as Naples and a successful merchant. And he chose to settle here in the Hudson Valley after trading with New Yorkers. Now, my mother, Mrs. C, was a highly sought after and accomplished dressmaker, as I mentioned before. And they initially settled in New York City, where they went about growing their respective businesses. My father, his merchant business, and my mother, her dressmaking business. But when my sister and I were born, my sister first and then me, my mother decided that it would be more advantageous for us to be raised out of the city and in the country. And I put a note here for me to say that I do not agree with my mother's observation in that, but she is my mother, or I should say was my mother. She has passed on, and it was her decision to make for us at that time, and I always respected her decision. But in her place, I did not make that same decision. So off to a town called Haverstraw we went. My father kept his shop in New York City and hired a very successful manager to manage the shop here, and he opened another shop near Haverstraw, which my father ran. Now, of course, this would entail occasional visits into the city on my father's part to meet with ship captains, to place orders, and to make sure everything was running in the shop here. And he also let the house that belongs with the shop at that time, as we had no use for living in it. Let's see. So my dad ran the local shop, and I grew up in the same set of children as Mr. Q. As I mentioned last week, the children of the Hudson Valley grew up in a social set. All of our families, all the children grew up together, and we did everything together. We did birthday parties together, we camped and picnicked, and we learned and grew up together. And it was always expected that we would marry within that set of children, as all our families knew each other quite well. And I'll just note here, I'm going to talk more about it later, that my sister did not marry within our set. And I'll come to the reason why that happened, as we talk some more. As girls, of course, we were expected to learn from our mother all of the skills necessary to keep an orderly, within budget, successfully running household. This was the highest level of skills that a lady could attain. Of course, if the gentleman was out providing an income for the family, someone had to run the family home, and that was often left up to the wife. And I was recently discussing with a gentleman that he was very impressed with the way that particularly the Dutch ladies of the Hudson Valley were so much better at keeping the books for the family accounting than the men were. That this was a particular talent he felt the Dutch ladies had for keeping the accounting very precisely for the family. So it was often left up to the wives to do this, as well as everything else. So this would include making sure there are enough clothes for everyone for all seasons, working in the garden, right? And preserving vegetables and food for the winter, raising chickens for eggs, sheep for wool. My mother taught us how to work with wool, from shearing to combing to spinning to weaving, and I hated every minute of it. Ugh. To this day, I despise wool, but it's something else. But I had to learn. This was required to learn. My sister and I both learned that from our mother. We also learned about other types of fabrics, and of course, we learned dressmaking from her as well. We were taught to keep a household stocked with all of the family needs within the family budget. Clean, here comes Petey, the cute cat, clean, orderly, and always operating within the family income, right? Not overspending for the husband, and not all wives, stuck with that, but we were taught to. All of this was considered the greatest qualities for young women. We also learned needlework. Excuse me. All of us required to make something called a sampler, which was a piece of linen showing our talent at needlework. And that sampler would often include the letters of the alphabet, numbers, animals, people, plants, our name, and things like that. I hated it. I'm not good at it, and I hated it. But my sister's needlework was exquisite. Of course, my sister has always been beautiful and perfect in every way imaginable for a young lady. We are total opposites, where my sister always looked lovely and was mannerly and clean. I often, like the boys, I skinned elbows and my dirty socks, and I don't know. We were complete opposites. I think I was the son in the family or something. And as time went by, it became really clear that I was not good at these ladylike things. Oh, I also should mention, we began working on what were called our promise chest, or our hope chest, which included all the linens and things we would need when we got married. So young girls were expected to hand sew all of that, preparing for their wedding day, and all the girls and ladies in the family would work on the items for that chest. So I worked on that as well. I was miserable, except on the days my father brought me to the shop with him. It was on those days that I truly lit up with joy. I enjoyed counting the items and doing inventory with him. I enjoyed learning how to keep his shop books. I enjoyed interacting with the customers. I loved working in the shop. Now, I wasn't the only young lady with this talent, as there were many Dutch women who were excellent shopkeepers, very wealthy and successful merchants. And there's an infamous lady of my time who started out learning her father's merchant business, that young woman in Philadelphia with the name of Peggy Shippen, who later went on to marry General Benedict Arnold. Miss Shippen was also very talented at these subjects and learned from her father how to run his business as well. She was a very thoughtful woman, a very smart woman, and very capable of complex thinking, which leads many of us today to believe that she may have been the intelligence behind Benedict Arnold's traitorous acts. We'll get into that another night. So Miss Shippen learned these talents as well. But there were many Dutch girls dating back to 100 years before I was born who were successful merchants. So that wasn't so unusual where I was living to see the girls working in the shops and learning the father's businesses. My parents, like many of the Dutch parents, did believe that even daughters ought to have some level of education. So we were tutored. We learned, of course, to read and to write. We learned some basic math and geography, some science, read literature. We learned some history and things like that. This was much more in the Dutch and French Huguenot tradition than it really was in the English tradition. So again, this was something that was somewhat unique to the Hudson Valley, and that the daughters who had time to learn learned. Now, I don't want you to think that all the girls learned, because many of the families did not have a high enough income to provide the leisure time for daughters to learn, and that everyone in the family worked from sunrise to sunset and after, just in order to keep the family going. I was lucky enough that my father was a successful businessman. And so we had that time growing up. And my mother, of course, successful in her own business. But that's not to say that all families had the time or the money to offer that to their daughters. So we were very lucky in that respect, very fortunate. My sister enjoyed school somewhat. She learned what she had to learn. My sister is very crafty and smart. My sister learned what she knew she would need to provide entree into the society she was planning to join. So whatever she needed to learn to provide her with that capability is what she learned, and she learned it very well. And I, of course, just wanted to be my father and follow in my father's footsteps. And my father recognized that and realized that I would be the person who would inherit his business. Now, my sister used to go along with our mother when she would deliver the beautiful ball gowns that she made for some of the wealthiest families of the Hudson Valley and Albany area. My mother made fine gowns for these ladies, and my sister often went with her for fittings and to deliver the gowns. And my sister's beauty and manners and graciousness was not lost on a very wealthy family known as the Van R family. And before you knew it, my sister was betrothed to one of the Van R sons. And so my sister made her way into the very upper classes of Albany high society. And if you know who the Van R family is, then you may know that my sister is related to Mrs. Hamilton by marriage. So that is the society she married into, happily ever after. So my sister's studies and talents paid off well for her, and she's a very happy lady. But that was not the course I wanted to take. I wanted to run my father's business. And eventually he brought me to New York on trips with him and started teaching me the New York part of the business. And he brought me on ships and he showed me inventory and he introduced me to ship captains. They were all so gracious to me. Oh, young Miss C, who was so nice. And I began learning from the manager of his New York shop. And of course, eventually, Mr. Q and I were married. Mr. Q returned from his manly quest that we spoke about last week, and Mr. Q and I were married and made our way into the city where we moved into my family home, and I eventually took over running my father's shop. Now, I wasn't alone in this. Of course, my father came to help me. There was the manager of the shop, but I must tell you that I was mentored by one of the greatest she merchants of my time, Mary Provoost Alexander, the wife of the great lawyer James Alexander, who defended the printer John Peter Zenger in his famous libel trial, and the mother of Major General William Alexander, Lord Sterling, the shining hero of the Battle of Long Island in 1776. So Mary Alexander came from an old Dutch and Huguenot family of merchants, as, by the way, did Mr. John Jay. John Jay's family were French Huguenots and Dutch merchants as well, very successful. So Mary Alexander's family, similar. Mary's grandmother was the wealthiest woman in all of New York in the 1690s. And it was said that at the time she was mentoring me, that she may have been the wealthiest woman in New York with a fortune, I figured it out, in your time equal to $31 million. So Mrs. Alexander was a force to be reckoned with. It was said there was not a ship in New York Harbor or docked anywhere that did not have something aboard it destined for Mary Alexander's shop. And it was my goal to be the next Mary Alexander. So I learned from her. Now, some of the incredible highlights of my time, I'll never forget. My father was still running the shop, of course, in 1765, but I accompanied him on the night of October 31st to the Burns Tavern, where the merchants of this city signed a unanimous declaration against England for no trade until the infamous Stamp Act was repealed, unless it was repealed the coming January 1st. And I went along with my father for that historic vote, which of course would mean financial hardship for all the merchants in New York. But at that time, our freedoms were far more important to us than the making money with England. And you may know that that boycott, as you would call it, was successful, and the Stamp Act was repealed as all of the other colonies followed us. I also remember learning from Mrs. Alexander how to deal with the men in the meetings of the Chamber of Commerce. And Mrs. Alexander explaining to me that I could enter those meetings as a girl and be treated as a girl, or I could enter those meetings with my back straight, my head up, looking straight ahead as a lady, and demand respect as a lady. And she said, if I demanded that respect, the gentlemen would all give that respect. But it was up to me to demand that respect from them. And that I must never enter the room as a shy girl, but as a secure lady. And it worked. So a great mentor to me, the late Mary Alexander, a wonderful, wonderful lady in many ways. And her children, of course, wonderful, and grandchildren too. And her whole family instrumental in the American Revolution and our success in New York. Well, eventually, Mr. Q and I got caught up in the whole pre-Revolutionary War conflict here. What would we do? Were we going to be loyal to England or were we not? And of course, we became what would be called Whigs or rebels. And Mr. Q then became associated with the local Sons of Liberty. And we supported the Sons of Liberty in a number of ways. Mr. Q with his presence and activities, and us, of course, with financial donations and financial capabilities that we had. So there was some of that as well. And of course, you know that there is rumor that I wrote a well-known broadside to the tea drinking ladies of New York. So we contributed in various ways during that time. And I have great memories as well of some of the violence that occurred here. The Battle of Golden Hill in January of 1770, a great riot over whether or not we should pay to quarter the English troops that were living here amongst us as an occupying army. And of course, it was a violent battle or violent riot that occurred. At that time, my good friend, Captain Alexander McDougall, was in the jail for writing a broadside that exposed corruption in our government and fraud in our elections. And he spent 4 months in the jail as a result of that. But Captain McDougall went on to be Major General Alexander McDougall and recently became the first president of the board of the Bank of New York. So we have all been in this fight, you might call it, for a very long time. Now, eventually in 1776, as the war approached New York, you may know that Mr. Q demanded I leave, that our family leave and leave the city, as the city was clearly going to come under British attack. And in August of that year, we packed everything up, moved everything to Haverstraw. Our son enlisted in the army. Our daughter came with me. And after a month or two, my mother was completely frustrated and sick of me, which she said that I had become a useless city woman and that I was much more fit to go live with my useless aristocratic sister. Shipped us all off to Albany, where we stayed with my sister through most of the war, spending time now and then with my mother and father. My mother just found me to be, me and young Miss Q to just be, as she said, dead weight. So off we went to live with my sister. And it was a very nice time for us, especially nice for young Miss Q, as there was society at Albany. And of course, she missed the society she grew up with in the city of New York. So there was society at Albany. And of course, she met a suitor and married into a nice family as well with the help of my sister. My sister's connections, not mine, that's for sure. But I have great respect among my sister's associates as a successful merchant, as we do have that respect in New York for lady merchants. So the Revolutionary War went on. Mr. Q was away for years. I would occasionally see him, or someone would come through who had seen him, and I would hear of him and where he was. And eventually, of course, the war was won, and back to New York we came. And then it was up to us to rebuild the city. And we were all quite happy to be back, but faced an incredible job at rebuilding our city, which had two massive fires during the war and those years of British occupation. So it was quite a lot of work to do, but the merchant community again came together. We began working again. We began importing and exporting and creating, wealth and putting it back into the city, financing projects to rebuild the city. And before you know it, New York was on its way again. And of course, the inauguration of George Washington took place here in 1789. What better city to have the inauguration? And at that time, I got to meet everybody who was anybody, which was so much fun. My friendship began there with Mr. James Madison, of course. And I got to meet the president a number of times and speak to him, a very wonderful gentleman, President Washington. And I met Mr. and Mrs. Adams and many other people during that short year that the government was located here in New York, but it has since moved on to Philadelphia. And I think I mentioned last week that recently Mr. Q and I attended a lovely dinner at Richmond Hill, held by Mr. Burr's very talented young daughter, Theodosia Burr, on behalf of the Iroquois chief, Joseph Brant. Now, one of the regrets I do have about my life is that I have not traveled the way Mr. Q has. Mr. Q, in his life as a fur trader, has traveled all along the East Coast. He has traveled as far north as Canada and as far south as the Caribbean islands. And he has traveled quite a distance west into the Great Lakes. And my only traveling has been from Albany to New York and a bit to New Jersey and Philadelphia. I have not traveled much. Mr. Q has traveled many places and met many different types of people. I mentioned last week that he was close friends with many of the Iroquois nations. And so recently I was able to meet his old friend, Chief Joseph Brant, the Mohawk chief of the Iroquois. So that was a great thing for me, as I had never been in that part of our state before the war where the Native people lived, and they have now been banished to Canada. Hopefully they will be allowed to return. So something that Senator Burr is working on. And of course, Mr. Q advocates for as well. So that's a bit of my life very quickly, from little curly-headed Italian girl to successful merchant in New York. And I have heard people say that Mr. Q and I are now wealthier than Mrs. Alexander was, but I won't tell you if that's true or not. I will only say that we have created for ourselves a rather comfortable life here. So if you have any questions or comments about life for a woman in New York during that time, as I really only spoke about one particular type of woman. If you have questions about any other type of women growing up at that time, please feel free to ask in the comments or in the chat here on Zoom, and I will be happy to answer those questions. As my story is a somewhat unusual one. As a lady who became a merchant, most ladies did not. They had other paths they took in life. Like my sister, who knew at a young age that it's much more easy for a girl to marry up, right, than a boy to marry up. Because a boy who seeks a young woman of a higher income is seen as perhaps a lazy fortune hunter, where a girl who seeks a gentleman of higher income is just aspiring to be a great lady. So that avenue was open for my sister to jump into that aristocratic class that we find around Albany, New York, as girls were more capable of doing. If I had a suitor who had no profession or wealth of his own, my father would have booted him out of the house. Because the first thing my father would have thought was that this suitor was seeking his business and his own fortune, and perhaps not his very independent, difficult, not so always well-coiffed daughter. As my mother said, it was a miracle that Mr. Q wanted me, as no one else certainly did. My mother was very open in her opinions, very clear in what she thought of us. So my mother was very grateful for Mr. Q and loved him very much for taking my hand, as she was deeply worried that no other gentleman would ever have me. So my mother's thinking at the time, she may have been right. Had Mr. Q not come along, I might be an old spinster today. Still a wealthy merchant, but an unmarried one. Suspicious of any suitors, indeed. So, did we run into the Sons of Liberty that evening? Do you mean the evening that we signed the non-importation, non-exportation agreement? Yes, the Sons of Liberty were out that evening, but it was the next evening that they staged their massive funeral march through the city, in which they carried the banner that said, Lady Liberty has died of a cruel stamp to her vitals, and an effigy of the governor, and a gallows, and a number of other things that would not be so interesting to you. But when they got to the Bowling Green, they stole the governor's chariot that he enjoyed driving around New York in, and burned the chariot and the effigy and the gallows on the Bowling Green. So I was not allowed out to watch that. My father was very strict.
It's Bill again.
Yes.
I was just going to ask, how were women treated when they wanted to go out to eat or to a tavern?
It depended on where you went. It was not unusual to see ladies in the coffee houses in the company of one another in New York City. So that was not unusual. We were not so strict that women had to always be accompanied by men, but it was unusual for a woman to go out completely alone. So I often went out with, you've heard me speak of her, my good friend, Mrs. R., the printer's wife. She's a printer as well. She does as much work as he does. Let's be honest about these printers now. The printers, it's a hard job, and the ladies work just as hard as the gentlemen do. So I often went out with Mrs. R or my lady friends, but more often with Mr. Q. When I was a single girl, though, working with my father, I went out with my father or with Mrs. Alexander, always with an adult escort. I was not allowed out in society alone until I was a married woman, unless I was with a parent type of figure, and that was very common. In my time now, well, I see young Miss Theodosia and her good friend, Miss Delage, out together all the time. I see them often strolling arm in arm along Wall Street. They're only about 14 years old. This was not done in my time, but things have changed, and the young ladies are out together in each other's company, enjoying themselves, and of course, winking and flirting with all of the gentlemen along the Tontine Coffee House and the financial houses along Wall Street. They all know Miss Burr, of course, and they all flirt with her, and she responds in kind, but not in an unladylike manner. Of course, she is always proper, as she is Senator Burr's daughter. And of course, the Hamilton daughters are out as well, and the girls are out in society a bit more freely and a bit younger than during my time. And during my time, my mother thought we were out in society too young. As far as my mother was concerned, we shouldn't have been out of the house until we were married at all. And that if we went to a dance, there had to be a matron for each young lady there, standing close by, watching every move. So you see, as generations go by, these traditions loosen up a little bit, I think, as well. As I must say, as has the clothing loosened up a great deal since my time. Wow. And the hairdos, I won't talk about that. I believe the clothes of this decade are quite a treat for the gentlemen. I wouldn't wear them. I'm too old. But times, there are some ladies my age that are wearing these very low necklines. I don't know. I think it's appropriate for a lady my age, but some do. Some still dress like they're very young women, but not me, and not my sister either. My sister is a proper lady. My sister is a grandmother, my goodness. She doesn't dress like her daughters. I don't know why a lady would do that, but some do. Other types of ladies, of course, there are farms in the Hudson Valley. Those ladies do not have the advantages that I grew up with. And I did not grow up with the level of advantages that Anne Elizabeth Schuyler grew up with. So, of course, there are different levels of advantages that girls had. Elizabeth Schuyler and her sisters had great advantages that I did not have because of the Schuyler and Van Rensselaer family fortunes. My father's income was far more moderate, but it was enough for me to be tutored and to have some freedom, and for my mother to have some help in the house with the chores and to not be completely dependent on her daughters for everything. There are plenty of families around us, farming families, where the whole family did all of the work day till night, and the only reading or writing the girls knew was the sampler that they sewed, that they showed that they could accurately in needlework represent the alphabet and numbers, but that did not mean they could necessarily read. It meant that they could reproduce the letters and numbers in order to include them in their needlework. And they knew how to sew their name and perhaps write their name, but that might be all. So that didn't mean the young lady was educated, but that she was good at needlework and reproducing things through needlework so that she could do beautiful needlework. So that was different. Those families didn't have the leisure time mine had in order to educate their daughters or even their sons. I mean, there are many, many men who did not read and write either. Or if they did read, families read from a Bible, might have been the only written book they had in their house, or maybe something like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress or Milton's Paradise Lost. We had to read Milton's Paradise Lost. I don't know if you still read it in your time. Spare me that. Oh, Mr. Crane making us read Paradise Lost. Oh, my goodness. Oh, if my sister was here, she would be laughing so hard. My sister was mischievous. She would mix up all the words and pretend she didn't understand anything just to fluster him. She was more mischievous in that respect than I was. He would act like a dummy just to fluster him. He would get so angry. He would say, "My dear Miss C, I know you could not be as empty-headed as you appear to be today." He's so frustrated. Those were good times growing up. It was very nice. And of course, my children were very well educated. My young Mr. Q having graduated the College of New Jersey or Princeton, and Miss Q, of course, not able to attend college, but still very well taught and on her own. So I'm hoping one day the ladies will be taught equally to the men. And I think Mr. Burr is trying to achieve that with his daughter, Theodosia, who is a very well-educated young woman. Other types of women we have, well, what if you live in New York City and suddenly you have no husband to support you? You're a widow. If you have other family members, they'll take you in. If you have no family members, you may end up living in the almshouse on the commons, which is reserved for elderly people who have no income and no family to take them in, women who are widows maybe and have no family, or ladies who never had a husband and have children in the times before the war, some of those belonging to the British soldiers. So there is an almshouse. There are also religious organizations who care for people like that. Our various churches here in the city. It's very difficult to support yourself as a woman. There are very few things available for a woman to do. In the case of me growing up, I had the privilege of growing up with the Dutch who taught their daughters business. That was not the norm. Girls generally did not know these things. A woman might be able to make money as a seamstress if she was good. A dressmaker, as my mother, making dresses and ball gowns and things, might be able to support herself. And of course, the only other way for a woman to support herself would be in the taverns or the houses of prostitution, unfortunately. And there are many ladies who fall into those roles or in the theater. So it is not easy for women who do not have a male counterpart to support them. This is not, a time where, women are welcomed into the workforce in any way equal to men. So it is very difficult for women who do not have a man to support them. And so you see a great deal of competition among women for, of course, the wealthiest men and the most capable men. Now, when Captain McDougall's first wife passed away, he was left with a number of children. There was quite a competition here in New York to be the next Mrs. McDougall. Not that the next Mrs. McDougall necessarily wanted to raise all his children, but was happy to raise all of his children in return for living with him and his great fortune. So Captain McDougal, found a wife pretty quickly. And for men who lose their wives, they need to find a wife rather quickly, especially if they have children, to care for those children as the men are out working to provide for the family. So you might be lucky enough to catch one of those men, but it is not a time for women who are out on their own. It is a very difficult life for women who do not have a husband or a father or a brother or a male cousin or someone like that to provide for them. Very, very difficult. Very few things open for them to do.
Was it the woman's job or the man's job to go out, I guess, every day to the water pump and get the water for the household?
It would be the women's job or the children. Send the children out to get the water. And if you were in New York City, that water pump was a good distance away. If you had servants, as some of us did, the servants went and pumped the water and carried it down into the city. For those of you who do not know, within the confines of New York City itself, it's very difficult to find any drinkable water. Therefore, everyone goes to the tea water pump, which is located around where our city hall is today. And oops, I switched that the wrong way. I'm sorry. There we go. I'm sorry about that. Hi, Bill. So if you have been on one of my tours or Lower Manhattan at all, if you live where I live in Hanover Square, that's near Wall Street, the tea water pump is all the way up where the Brooklyn Bridge is today. So about a mile away. That's a long distance to carry water. Water is heavy. It's a long distance. But some people sent their children to get the water, or some people sent servants. People paid them to go get the water. And of course, in the small towns, everyone had wells, and water was actually more available if you lived in a rural setting than if you lived in the city, as there was no good water within the boundaries of New York City for a very long time. And one night we may talk about the infamous Manhattan Company that was formed, they said, to bring water into New York City, but really was formed for a very different reason. And for you in the 21st century, that company exists today. In your time, it is called JP Morgan Chase. So maybe one day we'll do a little talk about the two banks of my time, the Bank of New York and the Manhattan Company, and how they came about and what they were both up to at that time. Things are not always as they seem. Oh, Miss Sturgis tells me about my mother's criticism of me, but it seems to have worked out for the best. I think my mother thinks it worked out for the best as well, that, me following in my father's footsteps and marrying Mr. Q worked out very well. Excuse me. So I'm getting a very dry cough now. Excuse me. So I'm going to say goodnight. I apologize for the abrupt ending. It's my cold and sore throat. So, so good evening tonight, and I will see all of you next week. And look for the information about watching me on Sunday and next Thursday. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you all again next time. Good night.